mission. In our incinerator, we feed it 3,000 tons of waste a day. Is that right? Alive. And poor Mike, he's lived in that area where the incinerators are, and he's telling me that a lot of people, including his family members, are now suffering from cancer. So we're all concerned because we have a similar type of situation here. So let me give you some background about Mike. He's a national expert on energy and waste issues, focusing on waste incineration, its hazards, and alternatives. His mission is to transition communities such as ours from waste to energy facilities to clean energy and zero waste. Since the 1990s, his work has defeated dozens of waste incinerators and other noxious industrial facilities. His research has shown that H-Power waste incineration is the most expensive and polluting way to manage waste and to make energy. It's dirtier than the recently closed AES burning coal and worse than using landfills. So let me pass this out without any further ado. Mike Ewall.
I'll be handing around a sign-up sheet afterwards if you want more information on
Air pollution, all kind of pollution.
Alright, so I'll add to my introduction a little bit just to explain the context that I come to this issue in. I grew up next to Philadelphia. I now live in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And we're surrounded by the biggest cluster of trash incinerators in the country. Whichever way the wind blows, one of 5 incinerators surrounding me, I'm breathing somebody's trash. And Philadelphia is the poorest large city in the U.S. and is one of the worst in terms of asthma and cancer in the whole country. And almost every household I know on my little street has somebody with cancer, including my own household. So this is very personal to me. And I've been working on this issue since high school, where my family lives in a county where a trash incinerator I bought 30 years ago and then got built is the largest air polluter in the county I grew up. And one of the 5, a different one, is the biggest one in the country. And of the 7 biggest polluters surrounding Philadelphia, 5 of them are trash incinerators. We have numerous other industries, but those are among the worst. And so I've been spending my last 3 decades of my life educating and helping people fight this industry because it's so harmful to communities that has become a big priority. And my mission is to get all 66 remaining trash incinerators in this country shut down, hopefully in the next 10 years, so I can move on and fight other things after that. So I've been helping folks in Hawaii ever since 2015, when folks on the Big Island brought me in to help them stop the same company that built one in my home county, the company that burns trash called Ewall. And they stopped them. There was one of 2 or 3 times they had threats of that on the Big Island, and they stopped that from happening. But here on Oahu is the only trash incinerator in the state, and it's the 3rd largest in the whole country. It can burn up to 3,000 tons per day of trash, and that's just very dangerous and polluting for people who live in that area. So I started a group called Energy Justice Network over 20 years ago, and I've been running that ever since. And I'm now starting a new project called Beyond Burning, which is why you see that here on the handout. And I've been speaking to other community groups, to the legislature just yesterday, and to some other events coming up that you'll see on one of the last slides here if you want to go even deeper in this in the next few days. There's an event on Saturday at the Waianae Coast Community Health Center, and another one in Honolulu on Monday. So I welcome questions as we go, but if they're long answers, I might hold them till the end, but feel free to jump in and make this interactive because I want this to be centered on what you want to learn from me, and also please teach me. I don't know everything about what's going on here. I'm learning, and I would love to have the wisdom and experience of those in this circle as well. So yesterday I was speaking. Yes, I see a hand already. Please.
I'm sorry, but I have a dream. And my dream is that, first of all, this island has, 80% of the population of the state? And yet we produce less than 5% of the food that's consumed on Oahu. Right? It's not because of lack of land, it's lack of thinking. We have a lot of trash that needs to be disposed of, and it needs to go into the ground in a way that will create good soil. So no plastics, no metals, right? And if we took our growing land in Waimanalo or out here, look at all this land over here. We could probably bring back farming in a huge way. Our biggest problem would be finding enough farmers, right? But water would not be a problem. Electricity would not be a problem if we knew how to generate it. Mr. Musk has a way of doing that. So my hope is that we can get back to, the state has a goal to do a third, I think it's a third of the food eaten in Hawaii is grown in Hawaii by 2030. It won't take that long. It won't take that long. It takes 2 years to compost it.
Thank you. We'll be talking about composting too, so that's definitely part of the solution here. Thank you for that. Yes.
I'm sorry, I have another question. And what you know, is it possible to do 100% recycling of all trash?
We'll be talking about what we can do on that. So yes, you're on the right track. Okay, so let's get into this, and I think a lot of your questions and comments will get addressed. So I have a slide here that I discussed at the Capitol yesterday about climate solutions and about what the false solutions are. And I won't get into all of that because this will take days to get into all these things. But if you see something on this false solution slide and you're thinking, gee, I thought nuclear was a solution, or I thought something else was a solution, feel free to come back at the end and ask me about it, and I'll spend as much time as you like explaining what I can share about why these are things I would call false solutions. A lot of the false solutions that I see have been targeting Oahu specifically and Hawaii in general. And I think it's your geography that's causing a lot of companies with crazy schemes that generally don't work to come here and say we can turn all kinds of waste into jet fuel and all kinds of fantastic ideas that are not really fantastic but are a little crazy, but are polluting and dangerous for communities. And the communities that they tend to target are either in the Campbell Industrial Park or further out in this direction. And so I want to help you understand what some of these are in a general sense. So if you see them, you see companies that are saying we're aloha carbon and we're going to turn one waste into wonderful things, you can question that and think maybe I should talk to Mike and find out what's not so wonderful about that so we can work together and stop them. So when I was flying in, I took this picture of Campbell Industrial Park out the plane window, so it's just a nice angle. I thought I'd include that. But that's like the scar on this island where they tend to concentrate all of the noxious industry. And you'll see a lot of that if you turn the page on the next slide, where it talks about existing and proposed waste and energy projects. There's a little line there below the first three facilities, which are the H-Power trash incinerator, which we started to talk about, the Waimanalo Gulch landfill, which is largely taking the toxic ash from the incinerator, and then even closer to here in Nanakuli, you have the PVT construction and demolition waste landfill. And so all of this is being concentrated on the west side. These landfills are filling up, but the incinerators are also getting old, so we'll get into that a little bit more. But below that, you see 6 bullets of things that are not here yet. These are companies that want to locate bad, toxic projects here, but they don't come in and say, I have a toxic project for you. They say, I have a global warming solution for you. I have a renewable energy project for you. I have something that's going to make your waste go away and turn into good things. And I want you to be skeptical about all of these things because there are reasons to understand why they're dangerous for the community and why communities elsewhere in the country compete to keep these technologies out of their communities. and they work to fight them because they've learned why they're so dangerous. So here's just a bit of an outline of some of the company names, the things they want to do, and I'm happy to dive into that if you have questions at any point. Now, the next couple of slides, we got Waimanalo Gulch Landfill. Took that picture when I was here last year, and the next picture is that landfill up close. And then you have that map. And this map here is where they're looking at places where they can build a new landfill. Some of you may have seen this already. Most of that map is colorful because those colors are saying where they cannot build a new landfill. So there are only 4 little white patches on that map where it's legal to build a new landfill because they promised to close Waimanalo Gulch. They promised in 2002. Now they're saying 2028 is when they'll close it. I don't think that's going to happen either because they don't have enough time to site and build a new one in just 5 years anyway. And they have a lot of room left there, and no decision maker is going to say, here's where we're going to put a new landfill, because people will go crazy, they will organize and they will stop them, and they will possibly lose their political career just for putting a pin in the map and saying this is the place for the next one. And so they were responsible to pick a new place by the end of last year for where a new landfill would go. And as I predicted way earlier that year, I said they're not going to do that. There's no way those people are going to pick a point on the map and say it goes there. Who would do that when they know they have extra space? All of these places they can put it are above aquifers, and some of them are in the same community. They don't want the political consequences of having to do that when they're not forced to yet. So they ended up deciding, well, we couldn't figure it out, so we need 2 more years. And so that's just the first of probably what will be numerous delays in deciding who is next to have the landfill for this island. So, and then if you flip the page here, you'll see the pictures I took of PVT. That's the construction and demolition waste landfill that has even less space and less time before it fills up, and that's where demolished buildings are going. And that's something that I'll answer one of the questions about alternatives. There's a little bit later in this, but I'll get to that right now. One of the things that we've worked on, particularly in Baltimore, Maryland, is alternatives for construction and demolition waste. There are communities like San Antonio, Texas, like Portland, Oregon, and others that have done a great job in mandating deconstruction of buildings. So instead of demolishing buildings and creating construction and demolition waste, they're hiring people. Like in Baltimore, they've had nonprofits hiring people straight out of prison to get jobs in the deconstruction industry. There are a lot of jobs when you have to carefully dismantle a building compared to just taking a wrecking ball and creating a bunch of waste. And then there's a lot of value in those materials that you can reuse and if not recycle, but a lot of it is woodwork that has value, especially in older buildings. So they can reuse a lot of that material and then create jobs, create economic value, and not have to have a PVT landfill filling up with valuable stuff that's just been turned into waste. You create waste by mixing things, by combining stuff.
What was that called?
Separate.
What type of demolition was that called?
So it's the alternative to demolition is deconstruction.
Deconstruction.
Yeah. There's a website we have called Rebuild Be More for Baltimore, but just the letter B, M-O-R-E, rebuildbemore.org, and you'll find videos about what they've done there. And there's a law that we're working to get passed that a city council member who works on housing issues is excited to champion. And hopefully they'll be introducing it this year to mandate that they deconstruct instead of demolish older buildings in Baltimore. Yes?
There's a company on Sand Island called Reuse Hawaii. Yeah. And that company takes apart homes, takes them apart, puts the material in their warehouse on Sand Island, and sells it to the public. I built my house 10 years ago only from lumber from there.
That's amazing. Yeah, there are a lot of examples like that around the country in
Got
different
another
places.
warehouse in Campbell, the same company, but they spread it out to Campbell.
Oh, that's great.
That was open at one time. They closed it down because they didn't have enough business. Then just opened it back up again.
Great. Before you leave, write those names down for me. I'd love to know more
As soon
about
as
them.
lumber prices went up a little bit.
Yeah, it's a big deal here. So the next slide here, slide number 10, I talk about the best way to have a landfill. Now, the worst thing I could do is come in here as an outsider and say, you should keep that landfill open or build a new landfill here. I am not doing that. Let's be very clear. I'm not taking a position on where your landfill should be. That's not for me to decide. But there are positions that your government will take, like keeping it open as long as they can because they have space. That's just a natural thing for them to want to do because it's easiest for them to do, right? And it's also dangerous in some ways to say we're going to pick a new place because all these places are above aquifers. So it's not a good idea to pick the places that they've already identified. Maybe they have to find a different place that is currently excluded. Some have talked about federal land being eligible. I don't know enough about that to know if those are better locations. But if we were to have criteria that everyone can agree on, no matter what community the landfill ultimately ends up in, let's find ways to make it the least harmful landfill possible. And so those are the criteria I outlined here on slide 10. I just want to walk through that really quick. First, you would want that landfill to be as far away from where people live as possible, so you don't have people suffering the impacts of all the trucks, the odors, other impacts from living next to it. You also would not want it to be above an aquifer, so it's not going to harm people's groundwater, of course. And to protect whatever water systems are nearby, you want to make sure they have as many liners as they can. Usually landfills will have one thin plastic layer and then other parts around it that pad it. But some, like hazardous waste landfills and all the landfills for trash in Pennsylvania, have double liners. You could even have triple liners. You know, give it the maximum protection because those liners will fail ultimately, and your groundwater will get polluted at some point. But the more protection you have, it slows that down and reduces it. But the one thing that I want to really drive home the most is that incinerator ash, we'll talk a lot more about incinerators, that's what makes these landfills much more dangerous. Even the PVT landfill I just learned last night is taking incinerator ash from H-Power, but the Waimanolo Gulch landfill primarily is taking that ash. And that is much more dangerous than just unburned waste going there because it's a lot more toxic, and we'll get into that a little bit later. It's better to have a bigger landfill that's less toxic than a smaller landfill that's more toxic, because it's not the size of landfills that harms people, it's the toxicity. So appreciating that, I think, is an important criteria. But there are also other states that say, well, we're going to ban certain things from landfills. A number of states have banned recyclable materials and clean compostable materials from landfills. That way they make sure they actually get recycled and composted. Where here in Oahu, a lot of things you put out for recycling don't even get recycled, they get burned and then the ash goes to a landfill. That's a whole bigger problem. You can also have landfills where the organic material that's in the waste stream, like things like that go thrown in the trash because no one has a composting bin nearby, so organic material still goes there, to biologically stabilize that, like use an anaerobic digestion kind of process, like composting but in a machine, so you can capture that gas easier than you can capture it in an open air landfill with pipes. And that way the landfill is not going to be so gassy and stinky and not have as much leachate. It makes the landfill less dangerous and noxious in the first place. And then a lot of landfills are also managed as if they're energy facilities. We have a renewable energy mandate in Hawaii and a lot of other states that says burning landfill gas for electricity is renewable energy, and they can get credits for doing that. And so they have an incentive to make more gas, and by doing that with the methods that they use, they capture less of it, so more leaks into the community, causing diseases in the community, just so they can get more gas to burn for energy. These are not supposed to be energy facilities. These are meant to be managed as waste facilities. In their initial regulations, they used to call them dry tomb. They want to keep them dry, because when you have more rainwater or more compostable stuff getting in, that's where you get these gases. You don't want them to manage them or mismanage them in a way that's designed to get more energy, because that ends up doing more harm to the community. So manage them as their waste facilities and stop trying to create these incentives to make energy out of it.
Are you saying they need less water or more water?
If they want to make energy, they need more water, because that's what makes things break down, and then you get the gas. So it's better to have landfills on the dry side of islands, so that's not great for this conversation here, because you're all like, well, we get all this stuff already, and this is the dry side of the island. But it is better ultimately to have less rainwater in your landfill as far as those harms go.
Why less water?
Because it's the water that causes the degradation. It causes things to break down and form the gases, the odors, the leachate.
You know why?
because of decomposition from, yeah, what are you
It's
trying
a
to
lack
get?
of worms.
Okay, well, yes.
If it's toxic, there aren't going to be worms.
Yeah, I know there are a lot of worms in apples, but maybe. So let's move on to talking about the incinerator here. So H-Power, sitting in Campbell Industrial Park, that, like I said, is tied with two other incinerators for being the third largest in the country. So there are three of them that are 3,000 tons per day of trash. One of the five that surrounds Philadelphia, where I live, is 3,500 tons per day. But most of the other ones are much smaller. And this one has 3 burners in it, and they're only burning about a little over half of what they could burn. The most recent data is about 1,800 tons per day of trash are actually getting burned. And 2 of these burners are pretty old. They're about, in November, they'll be 34 years old. Now, the average age of the 50 trash incinerators that have closed down since 2000 was 24 when they closed. And these 2 older ones are already 34. So, oh, sure. So, most incinerators do not make it to their 40th birthday, and it would be unreasonable to expect that 2 of these 3 incinerators that they have at H-Power are going to last more than another 5 to 10 years. So right now you have one problem in that it doesn't have enough waste to burn, and you have contracts with it between the county that owns it and the private company Cavanta that operates it that says we're going to give you enough waste, and if we don't give you enough waste, we're going to pay you anyway. Which means that when they have recyclables that they have to pay to get rid of, but they don't have enough trash, they're feeding the recyclables to the incinerator. Even though you're spending your time separating them, they are burning them anyway, so they don't have to pay them a penalty to not use the incinerator. That's just craziness. There are a lot of incinerators have this. Usually landfills don't have those kind of contracts because you can fill them up slowly, and that's a good thing. But incinerators, they have to burn a certain amount to stay profitable. And so right now you have the problem of not having enough waste to feed it, but by the time these older burners burn down with an accident or have malfunctions or shut down for financial reasons, which a lot of them are doing around the country. There's actually one in Florida that had an out-of-control fire for 3 weeks back in February and shut down for good. And a lot of pollution in the community coming from just mountains of trash burning with no filters at all. And should that happen, and it can happen at any time. It's been happening at many others, so it's not just Florida where they're having out-of-control fires. Those can shut down. Then you have a different problem where you don't have enough capacity to handle your waste because 2/3 of your main waste disposal facility will be shut down. These 2 older burners are also missing half of the pollution control devices that most incinerators have. Most of them have 4 pollution control systems. They're all for different pollutants. The 2 that they're missing here are the same 2 that they're missing in the biggest one in the country, the one not far from me. One of them protects, I shouldn't say protects, but it reduces somewhat the amount of nitrogen oxide pollution that comes out. And that's the pollutant that triggers asthma attacks. When I spoke a couple nights ago to the Pearl City Neighborhood Board, the chair even indicated that when there are Kona winds and the wind blows Campbell Industrial Park's pollution right down the valley toward his house, and he has asthma, he has to close the windows, and it affects him. I've heard from others with similar stories. Well, they don't even have the controls to try to have a more reasonable level of the pollutant that's triggering asthma attacks. They also have no controls for the most toxic pollutants like mercury and dioxins. They just are missing that completely. It's called a carbon injection system, and those 2 older burners just don't have it at all. Now the newer burner, the one they built about 10 years ago, that one has the 4 control systems. However, even that one would not be legal to build today. If they permitted this past year a new incinerator to be built in this state and installed the plant they have right now, they would not be allowed to operate any of those 3 burners because they cannot meet modern requirements, even for nitrogen oxides, which they have the controls for because the modern standards are 2 to 3 times stricter than what H-Power is using, even at their new burner that's only 10 years old. So you're dealing with antiquated technology that would not even be legal except for the fact that older facilities have older standards that they're still allowed to follow. Alright, so let's flip the page here and see what else we got. Alright, some of this is though small to be able to read. I'm just going to give you the high points of what this is, and you can get the full blown version of this if anyone signs the sign up, so you can have the more readable version we can email out to you. But I did an analysis of EPA's data on the power plants on this island. And the coal power plant that shut down last year, AES, in these 4 charts, that's the 4th one in, and then H Power is the last one. The first 3 are all burning oil. One of them is the one close to here, the Pokai power plant. It's a very big oil burning power plant. There's also one in Campbell Industrial Park and one near Pearl City as well. So those are the first 3 lines in here. And you'll see that H Power, the trash incinerator, is as bad or worse on most of the pollutants as these big fossil fuel power plants. Even compared to a coal plant, they were far worse on most of these pollutants. The greenhouse gases on the last chart here, the big blue lines, they're the worst of them. On hydrochloric acid in the first chart with the orange line that's really tall, it outweighs everything else. All these pollutants are things that either are blowing out to sea or at some point you're breathing them. And the trash incinerator is the worst of the culprits for a lot of these pollutants.
Ted?
Now, the slide after that where it says H Power is a huge polluter, that will give you the numbers on how many pounds of different pollutants they're putting out and where they ranked a couple years ago. Well, this is 2017 data. 2020 data just came out, so sorry I'm using older data on this. It only comes out every 3 years to be able to look at all these sources. Some of these where they were number 4 or 5, some of them they were already the worst in Oahu, but some of them are 4 or 5. Now they're 3 or 4 because the coal plant shut down, so they're a bigger source of that now. Now, the next slide, trash incineration. There's that website will have more information on it. I'm moving information from an older website over there, so check back occasionally to find more resources there. But that chart below it, you'll see how many incinerators are operating in the country over time. And you'll see that the trend is that they're shutting down. No one's really building new ones. They've not managed to build a new one at a new location in this country since 1995, because every time they try, people fight it and stop it. So this is a very unpopular industry for good reason, and they just shut more down each year, but they can't build more because people are very successful at stopping this industry. And let's flip the page here. I already talked about the lifespan. The next couple of charts compared to coal in a general sense. You can see there's one that says incineration worse than coal, and you'll see how many times worse than burning coal they are for different pollutants. And that slide 18 is on a national basis. The next one, 19, that's not me doing it. That's the state government of New York put out this data. They have 10 trash incinerators, more than any state, are in New York. And they used to have 8 coal power plants back in 2011 when they put this. They shut all their coal power plants down, just like here on Oahu, but they still have all their trash incinerators. And when they analyzed it, they found, except for one pollutant, all the other ones, trash burning is far dirtier than coal. And we know coal is filthy. No one's saying coal is clean. But what's shocking about this is we all know coal is really filthy, and yet burning trash, even though they have more pollution control systems on them in general than coal plants tend to, are still dirtier, even for mercury, which we know is coming out of coal plants at large levels. Trash burners in New York, they found 14 times more mercury coming out to make the same amount of energy as if you were burning coal. And the next slide shows even on greenhouse gases, we find it's a lot worse than burning coal as well. All right, let's flip to the next page here. So dioxins and furans. Some of you who remember stuff about Agent Orange in Vietnam, you've heard the word dioxin associated with that. That's what caused a lot of Vietnam veterans to get cancers, get diabetes and endometriosis and other health effects caused by that chemical. It's the most toxic chemical known to science, and it largely comes out of incinerators. And when it does, it's not that we're getting exposed to it mostly by breathing. When it hits the ocean, for example, it climbs up in the food chain. It doesn't like water, but it loves fat, so it climbs up in the fish. And so most of the exposure people get, about 93% of your exposure to the most toxic chemicals known to science, are from eating meat and dairy products. And that chart where it says exposure to dioxins, you see most of them are meat and dairy. That's actually what made me go from vegetarian to vegan when I saw that, because I know enough about this chemical. I was like, oh my God, I'm eating this stuff on purpose. And it changed my personal habits, but I'm not gonna tell you what to eat, but it was a wake-up call to me to see that. So there's a story that communities get told with anything with a smokestack. I call it the smokestack story. And I hear from people I've never heard from before. They'll call me up and say, Mike, I live in Kansas and they're trying to build this thing. And I'm like, did they tell you this? And they're like, yeah, that's exactly what they said. Because it's the same story everyone gets told. And I want you to be armed in how to debunk that, because a lot of it is very deliberate misinformation. And they don't expect you to be able to poke holes through their story. But now you're going to be able to do that. So I want to walk you through the story real quick. So they'll say, don't worry, we have continuous emissions monitors on our smokestack, and we know it's coming out at all times. And the state has that information, and they're very aggressive enforcers. So if we go over those limits, they'll slap us really hard with fines. So trust us, we'll be within those limits, and those limits mean that it's healthy and safe. Has anyone heard any version of that before? Does that sound familiar? Not so much? Okay. Well,
maybe we don't ask the right questions.
If you start picking on the things with smokestacks, you'll start to hear the story. So when you do ask the questions, you'll hear bits of it. So here's how to fight back against it. First of all, they're not always within their limits, okay? They have violations, but when they do get fines, I mean, sometimes they get violations and they have 0 fines, which sounds a little crazy. I mean, we can't speed on the highway and get a ticket and get no fines or negotiate it down. Sometimes they get a fine and they say, well, how about I pay 1/3 of that? And the state's like, okay, sure. I wish I could do that with speeding tickets. I've had enough in my life, I'd be doing much better if I could. But companies get to do that. And they can't meet modern limits, and I described that a bit already, but the limits for plants like H-Power, EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, they're required to update those standards every 5 years. With trash incinerators, they have not updated those standards in 16 years, and they had to be sued. And a federal court instructed EPA earlier this year that they have to update those standards by the end of this year. And now the industry is suing to delay that, so it's probably going to take a little longer. But when they say, oh, we're following the permit limits, well, it's like, yeah, but other countries are stricter, and this country would be stricter if they followed their own laws and updated the standards for these old plants that they're not doing. So we'll see what happens when they update those standards. But those permit limits are also not based on health and safety. There's not like there's an amount that would hurt people, and they say, well, you can't go over this level because this is going to hurt people. It doesn't work that way. They have limits that are based on what the technology is able to do, and I've had multiple state regulators admit this to me, some we caught on video, admitting that that's just not how it works. It's not a health-based standard. And so when they tell you we're within the limit, they can't let that translate, or you can't let them make that translate into healthy and safe, because that's not what it means. But that's what they'll always imply, so that you think, oh, it must be okay then, if they're within that limit. Now, the next part of the smokestack story, you can flip the page here. Those permit limits are different for different size facilities. So if this plant was burning only 500 tons per day of trash, they would have a certain amount of pollution that can come out. But since they're allowed to burn 6 times as much trash, the amount of pollution they put out is 6 times larger. Just because the concentration-based limits, there are parts per million, or nanograms per dry standard cubic meter. It's all per something, per what's coming out of the smokestack. And so that the design of the permits, and this is the same for Kahe power plant, for all their power plants here, the bigger they are, and Kahe is a pretty big one, the more pollution they're allowed to put into your community. So it's not like there's a safe amount and they don't cross that line. It has nothing to do with that. It doesn't work that way. They also don't know what's coming out day to day. They test for about 3 pollutants on a day-to-day basis. Hourly, they have continuous monitors for 3 pollutants. Sometimes you get a 4th or 5th. Sometimes those are just like greenhouse gas emissions, which aren't affecting people as directly. That's a global pollutant, or like how dark the emissions are. But there are 3 pollutants that, like triggering asthma attacks, the nitrogen oxides, and sulfur dioxide, and carbon monoxide. Those are the 3 that they test for continuously. Everything else, they don't know what's coming out of the stack any moment that you ask them. For about 10 others at H Power, they test 1 day a year. The rest of the pollutants they test, not at all. And the analogy I like to make, the reason why I have this speeding car on the next slide here, is if we regulate motorists the same way we regulate smokestacks for most pollutants in this country, we would let people drive around with no speedometer all year, and we would enforce the speed limit by, on the highway, once a year we have a speed trap, and there'd be warning signs saying, warning, slow down, speed trap ahead. And the brother of the driver would be running the speed trap because the companies do their own testing or hire consultants to do it. They know it's coming up. It's intentionally done and required to be done under ideal operating circumstances. So it's not like you're catching them when they have startups and shutdowns and malfunctions when their emissions are much higher. They're not being caught when they're speeding because they know not to speed when the test is coming up because they're doing it themselves. It's kind of hard to pass an open book test, but that's what they have. So that's, yes, please.
So how does the community test maybe private testers to those facilities?
Okay, I'm going to get you to an even better answer than what you're asking. But first I'm going to tell you why your question is very common. You're not alone in this. Is going in a direction that's not as helpful as what I'm about to recommend. A lot of people think, well, we could just get a grant and get our own air testing, and there are handheld things you can test for very few pollutants, unless you get really, really expensive stuff. But the problem with that is, say you get your own testing equipment, say it's amazingly expensive stuff, you can test for like 10 different chemicals. You do that, and the first thing they're going to do is say, you can't prove it came from us. It was, well, especially the chemicals you can afford to test more easily, they're going to say, well, that's the same stuff that comes out of cars and trucks. That's the same stuff that comes out of the building heating systems. Or if you test for something more exotic that only comes out of industry, they're going to say, well, we're right next to this power plant and this oil refinery. You know, it could have been them. And even if you can prove it was them, okay, say you're testing something that the other industries don't have, and it could only come from them. Then their defense is, well, we are required to test once a year, and we were under the limit for that pollutant. So, sorry, you're out of luck. You can't prove anything. There's nothing that has to happen because you found some level of something. So the better way to do it, the solution is, do you want to ask first, or should I explain the solution? Okay. So the solution we've been applying in different places is to make them put these continuous monitors in the smokestack. And you can do that not as an individual, but the government can do that. The city and county can do that, or the state government can do that. And we've succeeded this past year in getting the state of Oregon to require their only trash incinerator, which is also run by Cavanta, but it's about a sixth the size of the one they have here, to have to use continuous monitors for dioxins, for PCBs, for toxic metals. They're going to be the first in the country to have to do that and gather the real information on what's actually coming out, and they're going to catch them speeding a lot more. And we have studies showing that for hydrochloric acid, for example, where they continuously tested the ones near me in Pennsylvania, and I looked at the numbers and I found that the emissions are 80% higher than what they think they are when they test once a year at the same plant. It's just different data, and that continuous stuff shows a different reality than the once a year test that is the only one you have here. 1 second, let me just finish my example. In Europe, where they've used this continuous testing for dioxins, the most toxic chemicals known to science, one of the studies found 30 to 50 times higher than the once a year test we use in the US. A more recent study found up to 1,300 times higher than the once a year test they use here. That would blow the lid off of this plant. If you find that that's a reality, but you can only force them to do that if you make them do it in the stack. And if we follow Oregon's example, and we have a legislator, Representative Lowen, who's willing to introduce the bill to make that the law here, and you can get your legislator here and all the legislators you can to vote for it, then you can find out what's really going on at this plant here. Yes.
We've got an easier solution.
Okay, let's hear it.
Get rid of the oil companies
Oh, yes, tomorrow.
because we don't have oil around here.
I'm going to borrow your chair.
All shipped in, right?
Yeah. So I'm talking about the trash incinerator right now. You can do this with oil pans, but getting rid of them is better. But this is a step to getting rid of them, because if you find out that they're 50 times more polluting than they're telling you right now, that makes other things possible, like going back to the legislature and saying, well, how about we have regulations that make them have to lower their emissions to what they were telling us it was.
Access to the information is really necessary.
Yeah, it's the first step to taking the action that actually forces them to clean up. And they can't afford to clean up. If you force them to be as low as they say they are now, they're going to choose to shut down. But there's another question. Do you have something else that's on the point, or do you want to go ahead?
I'd like to know what happened to the landfills that they already did make and covered over, because the land is still contaminated, the water is still contaminated, people are still getting sick from it. We can't grow anything on it.
Yeah, it's very rare that they dig up and relocate a landfill, and if they do, then you're talking about which other place it gets dumped on, right?
Valley is the landfill.
Yeah. So that land is basically a sacrifice zone. It's essentially going to be permanently contaminated as that landfill leaks more over time. There's not a lot that can be done about that. Even if they were to dig it up and put it somewhere else on a better liner system, and then you have to pick them somewhere else that ultimately will become contaminated too. There's still groundwater damage most likely that's already happened that's essentially impossible to clean up. In some places they pump and treat the water forever or put microbes in there, but most of the time they just decide we're going to do natural attenuation, which is the fancy way of saying doing nothing, and that nature dilutes it over time.
They're going to leave this contaminated and move down the road and contaminate.
Yeah, that would be one argument for not building new landfills and keeping it where it is so you don't contaminate a new place. But I'm not going to advocate that in a community where it's been unfair, there's environmental racism issues, and there are a lot of reasons why the community doesn't deserve to keep getting dumped on. But whether it stays here or not, those principles on how to manage it better so that the impacts are less protect everyone. And I hope that one thing we can agree on is no matter who on the island is stuck with the landfill over time, that these principles are applied so that everyone is protecting everyone as much as possible.
I want to say something about the landfill. I was here when everybody voted to have the landfill in this area, and it was because they weren't educated that the Waimanalo Gulch was there. Even if that, so, you know, unfortunately, many of these industries that are coming in are profit-based. They don't use the scientific method, they use the profit method. And a lot of times people say, well, I'm not political, I'm not civic-minded. And a democracy means we have a stake in it. And so we've got to do our due diligence to figure it out, yeah? So anyway, thank you, Mike.
Thank you. That's the first thing of truth I've heard all day.
So, do you have a question? Or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, okay. So if you flip the page here, you'll see an incinerator ash slide. It has a picture of coffee beans on it. And I want to explain why there's a picture of coffee beans on that slide. So when you burn trash at 8 power, it doesn't magically turn into energy. They use terms like waste to energy as if somehow it magically just goes away and turns into energy. That's not literally what happens. It turns into toxic ash and toxic air pollution. They also use words like trash to steam as if it's just water vapor coming out. But we're not just throwing ice cubes in our trash cans, and then we get water vapor, but it's a lot more than that coming out. When you burn 100 tons of trash, and you're burning a lot more than that here, but say we'll use a round number, 100 tons, you get 30 tons roughly of toxic ash, which is what's going to these two landfills, plus the Waimanalo Gulch. Now, if you pour water over coffee beans, obviously you're not going to get coffee, right? But you grind them up and increase the surface area, and now you can get coffee. It's the same principle with trash versus ash in a landfill. If you take this phone and chuck it into that landfill, it's going to take a long time before the toxic materials in this phone can reach me in a way I can eat, breathe, or drink them. But if you burn this phone, or trash in general, instantly 70% is now air pollution. And that other 30% is now in a form that is easier to blow off of trash trucks into the community where people can breathe it. it can blow off of the landfill into the community where people can breathe it and into waterways. And rainwater going into the landfill can pick up toxic materials in there and leach it into the groundwater more readily than if it were just thrown in like this, where rainwater is not going to pick up as much stuff and leach it out. And you also have toxic chemicals that will be in that ash that are not already here because they weren't formed until burning took place. The dioxins that are in that ash are formed by the incinerator, by the combustion process. They're not already in the waste for the most part. And so that's what makes it so much more dangerous to have ash than trash. And so that's why part of the answer is no matter what landfill exists and where, it'll be less harmful to have unburned trash in it than ash. And community involved.
Landfills will be totally ineffective unless you have worms in them.
I would say worms are best for your organic material. The worms should be with clean things that don't hurt their health either. And that should be the clean compostable materials, your food scraps and yard waste. You can have worm bins at your house even and put clean food scraps in yard waste. You don't want plastic and worms trying to eat that. Put the clean stuff in there and let the worms eat that. That's good. That can go back to the land, and then we can grow the food that you're talking about growing, because that's the way to do it.
Let's do that on a massive scale.
Absolutely. So there have been studies, a lot of this information came out just this past year, so I'm sharing with you some pretty fresh stuff. Some of it's not even fully published yet. And they've analyzed what's better or worse in terms of landfills versus incinerators. Of course, it's not versus incinerators, it's landfills versus both, because you have the the incinerator, and then the ash is going to a landfill anyway. So it's incinerators and with a landfill versus just a landfill versus a zero waste system where you have no incinerators and minimal landfills. So Delaware County, Pennsylvania, that's this slide here, slide 32. That's the one where they have the largest trash incinerator in the country. It's just outside of Philadelphia. And I've been working on issues there for close to 30 years. And they have decided to make their solid waste plan that they have to do for the state, a 10-year plan, to make it a zero waste plan. And I helped them write their criteria for their consultants, and they hired the right consultants, and not the ones most counties hire. And they decided we're going to hire zero waste consultants that know how to get us away from burning stuff and to do a real zero waste plan. So part of that plan included asking the consultants and expert in the field show us what is better in terms of incineration versus landfilling. So for all the people who need the data to believe it, we now have that data. So slides 33 and 4 are that data. And what this means, so slide 33, those first two bars are the incinerator. That's the biggest incinerator in the country. And these are 9 different criteria. The blue one is global warming. So that's the biggest part of it. And whether you're looking at the first or second one, the second bar is the same incinerator, just they get to subtract emissions, like when they make electricity, they're subtracting gas being burned somewhere else. And so they're saying, well, if you subtract that, then we're not as bad. But they're still worse than the third bar, which is the landfill that they have. And so the landfill is bad, but not as bad as burning it. And it's not even as bad for the climate to be landfilling waste. And most people think, well, landfills are terrible for the climate, and they are. They form methane. That methane is very potent. However, if you take the stuff that you throw in the trash and put it in a landfill, some of it's going to break down, like the organic material make these greenhouse gases. But a lot of the stuff is not going to break down easily, like plastics. They're going to sit there for a really long time and just not break down. And a lot of times people think, well, that's terrible. It's not going away. Well, actually, that's a selling point. That's good. You don't want that to go somewhere else. If it stays put, that's a good thing, because otherwise you're putting it in the air and doing a lot more damage. So the fact that plastics aren't breaking down, or that wood is breaking down very slowly, a lot of those durable things in a landfill, that's why the greenhouse gases aren't as bad as if you burn it and all that carbon immediately is going into the atmosphere. But it's not just the carbon. On these first two bars, you see that brown part, that's the particulate matter that causes heart attacks and stroke. The red part is the toxic chemicals that cause birth defects and cancers. The little yellow part there is the nitrogen oxides that trigger asthma attacks. With the landfill, you get much smaller slices of those than you do with all the stuff being put into the air when you burn trash. Now the next slide, slide 34, you see those two smaller bars. That small bar, the first one, is the status quo of the damage being caused by that county using an incinerator and then landfilling ash. If they go to a zero waste plan and switch to the landfill without burning first and reduce their waste a lot, they have an 85% reduction in that harm to health and environment. But that looks small because next to it, those next two bars are much taller. That's the status quo, the third bar of the benefits of recycling that they're already doing. This is harm that's not happening to communities around the world where resources are extracted, where like China and other places are manufacturing things. That's harm that would be happening if they weren't recycling. That's not happening, so it's framed as a benefit because of the recycling they're already doing. But those benefits double if they do a zero waste plan and boost the recycling, the reuse, the composting, all the things that should be happening here if you weren't feeding all those materials to an incinerator. So a lot of benefits to be had from doing the zero waste approach. Now the next slide is a little confusing, I'll walk you through it. The green, brown, and yellow bars. That's a Hawaii-specific study that just came out earlier this year. It was done for Big Island, and they looked at 4 different recyclable materials. The first 2 are types of paper, the second 2 are types of plastic. And they said, is it better to recycle it versus burn it here on Oahu at H-Power, that would ship Big Island's recyclables here and burn it, or landfill it in the landfill that they have in the west side of the Big Island? And so the brown bars are the landfill, the yellow bars are the incinerator here at H-Power, and the green bars are barging the stuff thousands of miles across the ocean to countries in Asia to recycle it. You might think, gee, the transportation is huge, barges, big dirty diesel, that would be horrible. How can recycling be worth doing if we have to ship stuff so far? And as it turns out, and as we've seen in other studies, transportation, even these big barges, are a tiny portion of the system. It doesn't even register. The benefits, the green bars, anything positive here is in green. That, if it's above that line, that's a positive thing. Recycling that stuff, even shipping it all the way to Asia, is a big environmental benefit. Whereas if you dump the paper materials into a landfill, you get those negatives, the brown bars of the greenhouse gases mostly being formed by landfilling the paper materials that are going to break down. The last 2, the brown bars, the plastics, they're not really breaking down the landfill much, so there's not much impact there. That's why they're so small. But the yellow bars are if you burn the stuff. If you burn the paper, much more pollution than even landfilling it. And if you burn the plastics, even more pollution. And so there's no doubt that the worst thing you can do is burn it. The second worst thing you can do is landfill. But the best thing you could do, even if you have to ship it all the way to Asia, is to recycle the stuff. And that's what decision makers on Hawaii Island were thinking, well, no, that must be so much worse to ship it far. And now we have a study that they pay for that says, no, you're wrong. Recycling is still better. And it's going to be the same story here. Your decision makers need to understand this charge so they can stop using excuses. They can make financial excuses and say, well, we're stuck in this bad contract, so we have to feed them something. But you can say, well, look at all the harm you're causing. You know, let's pay to do the right thing, even though you have this stupid contract you signed up for, and let's not have that again. So, all right, let's get through some of the rest of the slides so we can open this up to questions. Yes, please.
Does Asia actually separate the waste and actually recycle, or are we just throwing our trash in their country?
That's a great question, because there's been a lot of just dumping on other nations going on. So much so that about 5 years ago, China, after multiple efforts of tightening up the requirements, put, I think they call it the green sword this time, the green fence and other different names. But they basically said, we're not going to take your 40 sort of recyclables anymore. Sorry. Right. And they're being a dumping ground. You know, they have every right to say that. You're taking things that we have very high contamination rates and just throwing it else and shipping it off to them then to deal with it. So they tightened up the requirements. Then we started going to other Asian countries, and then some of them said, whoa, we can't take this all stuff either. Some of those closed the doors. And then domestic markets started catching up. So then the recycling market built back up in the mainland US. And so there are better markets in the industry starting to use recycled materials. Some better sorting starting to take place. But a lot of markets still are in Asia, and I don't know exactly where, how much, for what materials. But I do know folks who know that market much better than all right, so let's walk through the rest of these quickly, and then we'll be free for all the questions you have. So there are a couple of slides about health effects. I'm not going to try to read this to you, but you can see the different chemicals that come out of incinerators, and if you're able to read that small print, you'll see all the different health problems that they cause. And companies like Cavanta that run this incinerator, they put out fact sheets that say, the studies show, don't worry, be happy. There are no studies showing health from living next to an incinerator that's being harmed. And they're lying. I've looked at their footnotes. I've looked at the footnotes of their footnotes. I've seen that they're skipping over some studies conveniently, that they're misrepresenting other studies, and that there are studies that are showing that there are health effects. And it's hard to do a study and show health effects because there are often other industries nearby. There are pollution moving around. There is pollution moving around. There are people moving around. There's pollution getting into the food chain, and that moves around. So it can be hard to do a study well and show that this plant caused this impact in the community. But the fact that some studies have shown that is very significant. And when they have found these connections, a lot of what they found are types of cancer and cancer in general, but also respiratory, urinary, and cardiac or cardiovascular problems in people, which you expect to see from the types of foods that they put out. Do you have a question? Okay, buddy. All right, so let's talk about solutions for a minute. So zero waste jobs. There's a picture here. This is a deconstruction crew from Baltimore. So we talked about them already. These are people who got out of prison and got jobs taking buildings apart and recovering valuable materials. So that's just one piece of the solution. And there's a definition here of what zero waste means. I helped write this definition. This is an internationally peer-reviewed definition of what zero waste means. And it's defined to say no burning, and we're going to minimize landfilling and do all the right things to get as close as we can to zero. And a lot of times you use the word zero, decision makers say, oh, you crazy utopian people, we have waste to manage, we can't get to literal zero, you're just being ridiculous. And so I like to come back to them and say, well, if you're not for zero waste, how much waste are you for? Because a lot of governments will say, well, we're going to recycle 30% or 50%, which means that a certain amount of waste is just designed into the system and they're saying it's acceptable. And we don't do that with other things. We don't say, like with safety defects, we have zero safety defect policies. We have zero drug tolerance policies, zero tolerance for gun safety. We have zero injuries in the workplace. What CEO out here kicks off the year and announces to the shareholders, this year our goal is to injure 5 workers? Right? Like you get laughed out of the room. But that's what we do with waste all the time. We say this year we're going to harm non-Ukuli this much. We're going to harm the Waimanalo Gulch community this much. That's what they're doing when they don't adopt a zero waste system, because they're not trying to get to zero. We're not expecting they're going to get to zero, but they need to try. And they need to put the right policies in place so they can get damn close. And there are communities that have reached 60, 70, 80, even in some places like in Japan, there's an example, and I think in Italy, of 90% reduction of waste going to disposal. And that's possible. Real communities are doing this, but the policies that you need to have in place are not in place here. And a lot of times your decision makers will make excuses and they'll say, well, people are lazy. And usually they'll say even worse things. They'll say, those people are lazy. And we know what that means. You know, there's a lot of racist and classist language coded in when you have decision makers say, well, those people. And I've heard all kinds of decision makers say that. What we really need to say back to them is that they're the ones being lazy because they're the ones in charge of the system. And they're the ones not making it easy for people to do the right thing. It's one thing if you, like right now, I see cans over there. I don't know if either one of them is a recycling can. It doesn't seem well labeled. But I'll guarantee you neither one is a composting bin. And even if one's a recycling bin, I wouldn't know what to put where, but it wouldn't matter because they're still going to H-Power anyway, even if they have the right labels. So that's not my failing. That's an institutional problem that can only be solved at an institutional level. And it's the decision makers that are failing to do their job because they're lazy that need to be held accountable by all of us. So we've done things like in Baltimore, we've done a lot of work there, so keep going there for examples. We've done a pilot program where we gave out, the city was, they fixed this now, but they would give out large green trash cans, like 65-gallon big ones, and then charge for small yellow recycle bins. It was the wrong size, color, and cost. So we tried to fix that with an experiment. We bought recycle bins and just gave them out for free to households that signed up. And we hired block captains and had them go around and weigh everyone's trash bin and recycle bins. And we gave them educational materials on why it's important to recycle, why they'll breathe the pollution if they don't, because they have a big incinerator there, that's their biggest air polluter. And based on the measurements of the weight, we gave out cash prizes to the households that recycled the most. Now, that's the best we could do since we didn't run the city. We couldn't do the program I'll describe as an institutional level one. But what we found is that recycling rates jumped up a lot when you give people the tools they need, the education and information that they need, and an economic incentive. And we found this replicated across the country in that there's a system called pay as you throw. A lot of people don't like the word pay, so they call it save as you throw or other names. Excuse me. But if you think about it, with gas, with water, with electricity, you pay for how much you use, right? Well, with trash, your neighbor can put out 10 bags a week, you can put out one, and you pay the same amount, and it's not fair. So there are about 7,000 to 10,000 or more communities around the country that have a system where you pay per bag or per bin. And what you find is that instantly, as soon as they do this, people start to pay attention to how much waste they put out. And things end up in the recycle bin. And about half, you see on average about 44% drop in the amount of waste being generated. And half of that's going into the recycle bin, but the other half of that reduction is stuff that's not even being created in the first place because people pay attention when they go shopping and they're like, I'm going to buy these avocados in the not plastic bag. They're the ones that aren't in plastic at all. I'm going to get them instead. And people make those kinds of decisions because they're not being hit in the pocketbook. And so that's the most effective and cost-effective way you can get people to reduce waste. But you need to have that system in place. And you have to give them the other tools, like a place to put their compostables. If you give them the composting bin, the collection, like in Hawaii, they have trash collection every week. But to recycle, you have to drive somewhere and drop them off at a certain place. And there's no place to bring your composting, but recycling, you can go out of your way to do that. Well, of course, people are not going to recycle as much if you make it hard for them to recycle and easy for them to throw things in trash. It should be the opposite of anything. So there's some communities, not a lot yet, but they collect trash every 2 weeks. And you might think that's crazy, that's way too infrequent. Some places are getting it twice a week. But if you collect recycling and composting every week, and like you see these bins here, this is a picture from San Francisco. You have the blue bin is the biggest one, that's for recycling. The green one is for composting, it's the second biggest. And the trash one is the smallest bin. That's more like what the waste stream actually is. Because most of the things you're throwing away are recyclable and compostable. So your bins should be bigger because of it. And you shouldn't have that much that has to be collected. It shouldn't need to be collected as often. But people will freak out at first. They'll say, what, you're going to collect my trash every 2 weeks? My trash is going to stink. And then you tell them, well, why are you putting the stinky stuff in the wrong bin? Then the composting starts, then you have your worms and everything going on. Okay, so that kind of incentive, if you create the system the right way, people will do the things and they'll stop being lazy because your decision makers stop being lazy and put the right system in place. So people need to be demanding this so that we don't have to have the landfills and incinerators as much and we can have a healthy system.